All right, everybody, we are excited to be with you today. Bekka and I are both from the state of Utah, different ends of the state, but though we wish we could be in person with you, we do know that we get to reach even more of you with this virtual platform, and so we're really happy to be doing that. I'm just going to make one announcement. If you ever lose audio or the picture starts going funny for you and your computer, the best thing to do is go out of the Zoom and then come back in. And that will usually take care of those issues, just as a note if that happens throughout the presentation. So we're gonna go ahead and get started. I want to explain to you just a little bit of the
Andrea, I think you gotta end the poll, sorry. The poll box is still up on our screen.
Okay.
I think you have to stop sharing it. Sorry. Hit stop sharing, maybe?
I did click stop sharing.
Oh.
If you just minimize it, it should be okay.
Can you still see it? Because I can't.
I can't.
Okay, there it went. Sorry, we're good now.
Okay.
You're good.
Okay. So, can you see the PowerPoint screen?
Yeah, we're good.
Okay, so what I was going to explain is the resources that we provide through agriculture in the classrooms fill two different purposes. The first purpose is that it needs to meet agricultural education standards for teachers. Most of you are educators, and you guys know that you don't have time in your year and in your curriculum to do a lot of fun things or just interesting things. You really have some tight timing that you need to keep to so that you can get through your curriculum each year. So when we are looking to create resources for teachers to use, we are looking for things that meet your standards, so science, social studies, geography, health, nutrition, all those kind of things that incorporate with agricultural literacy. So we want them to reach your education standards, but we also want them to increase agricultural literacy. And the great news is agriculture is a really great place for you to be able to integrate and to contextualize these, in our case today, this science. So I'm going to start off the presentation today by just giving you some basics of climate change and the carbon cycle. This is the science, this is the anchor is what I'm going to be calling it. But we're going to talk about some of the science because you really need to understand the science and have that foundation and also know where this is going to fit in a classroom to be able to then use that to understand the agricultural literacy portion of it. So if you're a science teacher, this is probably a little bit of a review, something you already understand, but if you are not, this might be some good foundation for you. So the first thing I want to point out to you is our first resource that we're going to be sharing. This is called the Climate Change Phenomena e-magazine. We created this so that teachers could use it to use right in their classroom. I'm just going to switch my screen right here. It is, so Bekka is going to be sharing the link.
Yep, it's in the chat box if anyone wants to click on it.
Okay, can you guys see the Climate Change Phenomena e-magazine?
Yes.
Okay, all right, so this is the e-magazine, and this is something that you can share with your students to read in the class, to read at home. If you're still distance learning, that's going to be really helpful to be aware of. But there's 5 pages talking about what's the difference between weather and climate. It's interactive, that they can click on videos that explain even more. If we turn to the next pages, how does climate impact our food supply? So this is a big part of what you're going to be learning about today, is understanding that that our food, like climate change, so students are going to hear about climate change, they hear about it in the news, we all hear about it in the news, but are they making the connection between the science and the agriculture? And the connection is our food. So this is going to help them understand that crops grown across the nation and even the world all rely on a specific climate. Okay, I was also going to learn some basics on carbon. What is it? Where is it found? The difference between adaptations and mitigations, which we're going to talk a little bit more later in the presentation. But this is just a great resource that you can use, and it is linked in all of the lessons that we're going to be sharing with you today, so, and as well as in the chat. So you've got that at your fingertips. This is a resource that since we posted it, I know that it's had over 2,600 views by students. So something that's already being used. So if I go back to my slideshow, here's a little bit more about the carbon cycle. So know that in our world, we have, in our planet, we have 4 different spheres is what we call them. So we have the atmosphere, the biosphere, the lithosphere, and the hydrosphere. So this represents air for the atmosphere, living things, our land, meaning the Earth's crust, and then water is the hydrosphere. So in all of these spheres, we can find carbon. Okay, carbon is an element that can be found on the table of periodic elements. It's also found in compounds. So we have elemental carbon, we have carbon dioxide, for example, we have methane, for example, that's CH4. So carbon is found in many forms and in multiple places throughout our world. Okay, so that's important to know as just a foundation of the carbon cycle. As we start learning more, we understand that there's carbon in each of those spheres and it moves from sphere to sphere. So to start off, when you're teaching your students the carbon cycle, before we look at the entire thing, I like to show them a little bit simpler or linear example of how carbon moves from one sphere to another. So if we start here with fossil fuels, we hear a lot about fossil fuels. Fossil fuels is moving carbon from the lithosphere. So we get fossil fuels from the earth, and then we put them in our cars and move that carbon to the atmosphere or to the air. Okay, so there's just one simple linear example of moving carbon from one sphere to another. Okay, the next example is deforestation. We move carbon from a living tree. We cut it down and we put it in the atmosphere. Okay, digestion from cattle and other ruminants. We take carbon from the biosphere, because cattle are living, so that's the biosphere, and we move it to the atmosphere. We're going to talk more about that later. Plants, through photosynthesis, move carbon from the atmosphere to the biosphere. And respiration from the biosphere to the atmosphere. Decomposition, so for the example of a pumpkin decomposing in the earth, we're moving carbon from the biosphere to the lithosphere. Okay, so those are just some linear examples of how carbon moves from one place to another. If we were then to put it in a cycle, let's use those same pictures and put these there. And that just, this image just kind of shows you where carbon is moving throughout our atmosphere. And if you were to look at this, it's a fairly balanced movement. Okay, we've got photosynthesis and respiration from plants and animals. We also have it from fish and aquatic plants, decomposition. Okay, now I want you to compare that to, so this is the carbon cycle through naturally occurring processes. The carbon cycle would happen even without human interaction, human impact here on the earth. So then another part of many curriculums is to understand how humans impact the carbon cycle. So let's look at this example. The burning of fossil fuels increases the movement of carbon from the lithosphere to the atmosphere. Okay, deforestation increases, soil tillage increases, ruminant digestion increases. Okay, so if we were to compare these two, you can see why the human-induced processes start to put the carbon cycle off balance, which then leads to more carbon in the air, which more greenhouse gases, more climate change and stuff like that. Okay, so again, we're just building a foundation, understanding the carbon cycle, understanding what carbon does. So at this point, like I said, all of our lessons, we want them to have a strong foundation, a strong anchor in the science concepts that you're teaching in your classroom. So from this point, I'm going to leave you with that foundation in science and turn it over to Bekka to talk about the next step.
Okay, so one of the big questions we have with these lessons that we're sharing with you today is, where is agriculture within the context of climate change? So if you guys just want to take a minute and type in some thoughts and answers in the chat box, how you guys think agriculture fits in with climate change. Is agriculture contributing to climate change? Is it vulnerable to the impacts of climate change? So just take a second and type in some thoughts and answers that you guys can think of there in the chat box. We'll see what you guys come up with. So you have carbon sequestration. A lot of people are saying both. It contributes and it's affected by it. Oh, these are coming in fast. Yeah, a lot of you guys are saying both, contributing and affected by it. Stops erosion, both, good. Okay, so if we go to the next slide, looks like most everyone is saying both, which is correct. Agriculture is on both sides of the issue here. There are agricultural practices that contribute to greenhouse gas emissions, but as well as being vulnerable to the impact of climate change. And so that's where that fits in with, agriculture fits in with the context of climate change. And that's what we want you guys and your students to understand, is it's coming from both sides of the issue, and that most farmers and ranchers and agriculturists are conscious of this when it's the practices that they're doing do contribute to greenhouse gas emissions. So they're trying to find ways to mitigate emissions and carbon footprints, but then also looking at the other side, finding ways to adapt and figure out how to not be as vulnerable to the impact of climate change, which is what Andrea will talk about a little bit later on. But yeah, it looks like a lot of you guys are saying both, and listing different ways that it's contributing and affected by climate change. So if you go to the next slide, Andrea, here we have a nice pasture of cattle grazing. And when it comes to agriculture and climate change, and typically when people hear those two, when they hear cows and climate change in the same sentence, or agriculture and climate change in the same sentence, cows oftentimes come to mind for a lot of people, and cows kind of are infamous when it comes to greenhouse gas emissions and climate change. And so if there are consumers that are curious about how agriculture affects climate change and greenhouse gas emissions, a quick Google search brings up tons and tons of different articles. So choosing chicken over beef cuts our carbon footprints in half. Are cattle in the US causing an increase in global warming? Are cows climate killers? Gassy cows are warming the planet. Are they here to stay? How do cows contribute to global warming? And are my hamburgers hurting the planet? And so you can see from a consumer's point of view, it can be really overwhelming and confusing. And these cows don't have that great of a reputation when it comes to agriculture and climate change, and the effects that agriculture has on climate change and carbon emissions. So with all these questions, or with all these articles floating around and cows' reputation, we decided to come up with a lesson that kind of focuses on agriculture and livestock production and greenhouse gas emissions. If you want to go to the next one, Andrea. This secondary science lesson is called Carbon Hoofprints, Cows and Climate Change. And this allows students to think critically about, like I said, livestock production and climate change and the effect that it has on the planet and the environment and greenhouse gas emissions. And so this lesson, Andrea has it pulled up here on the agricultural matrix, the curriculum matrix. You can see it's kind of targeting 9 through 12 grade levels. But the purpose of this lesson is students will explore the carbon cycle and evaluate carbon footprint of beef cattle. Using critical thinking skills, students will use the claim, evidence, and reasoning model to determine the effect of cows' methane production on the environment and investigate the extent cattle contribute to climate change. And so this lesson follows the same format as all of the other lessons on the curriculum matrix. It'll give you the materials that you need for each activity. And then below are the essential files, and that's where you'll find the handouts or the cutouts. Anything that you'll need to do this lesson are all included in that essential files section. And then you can see there's a list of key vocabulary words, some did you know kind of facts about this particular topic, beef cattle, beef production, and agriculture. And then we get down to the background agricultural connection paragraph. And this is specifically written to help you as a teacher or your students kind of bridge that gap between agriculture and science, and in this case, climate change, and helping you see that connection of how cows contribute to climate change and their emissions, like we talked about earlier, and how agriculture is also kind of on both ends of that issue. But this background paragraph will briefly goes through the climate change basics. You can see there's a little video down there below. And then it talks about carbon in the earth and the atmosphere, which is what Andrea just explained to you guys. She went through those different cycles. And then we get down to actual ruminant animals and methane. And it really explains ruminant animals or livestock that have 4 compartments to their stomach and how they produce methane in their digestive systems and release it into the atmosphere. So this kind of breaks down methane emissions from cattle. And there's a lot of science in this section right here, and it's some pretty high level science. But what we want your students to realize is the process of how cows are producing methane in their digestive tracts is kind of a byproduct, and then releasing it through their mouth through either exhaling or burps into the atmosphere. And you can kind of see that there's a cycle right there about the methane biogenic carbon cycle and how methane is actually recycled depending on the livestock herd numbers in the US or in the world. And so in this paragraph, we kind of turn to Dr. Frank Mittlener, who is a professor at UC Davis. And if you ever listen to any of his podcasts, his videos, or read his articles, he really drives home the fact that if cattle herd sizes in the US stay the same or even decrease, then that methane is actually being recycled and no new carbon or methane is being released into the atmosphere. And that's something that this lesson discusses and goes over, and something you can kind of look into afterwards. But if you scroll down just a little bit more, it'll kind of dive into the carbon hoofprint or footprint of beef. And it explains how the United States actually has the lowest carbon footprint in the world for beef production. And if you look at that map, it shows that the green sections are lower carbon emissions or carbon footprint for beef production versus the purple areas. And that's has a lot to do with science and genetics, and how we're raising our animals today. They're more productive and they provide more meat and milk than cows did 40, 50 years ago. And so again, Andrea is going to kind of hit home on that at the end with how productivity comes into play with agriculture and climate change. But let's just kind of run through the lesson a little bit. I'll just kind of walk you through some of the activities and how you can conduct it in your classroom with your students. But it starts out with an interest approach. You can see those 6 pictures down there. Those are cards that are included in the essential files up above. So you can print those out. But you would put those 6 photos up on the board just kind of randomly and ask your students to match those up based off of just looking at the pictures. And so using some kind of critical thinking skills, they'd have to determine that the periodic table of elements would match with the diamond representing carbon. You have the pictures of your ruminant animals down there below matched up with the ruminant digestive system. And then you have the the methane molecule matched up with a picture of the greenhouse effect. And that'll kind of lead them into thinking about climate change, carbon emissions, as well as cows and ruminant animals. And then below that, first activity is kind of just what Andrea did with you guys, is just basically giving a layout of the carbon cycle, what it is, how carbon is cycled through those different spheres. And you can see with the picture below, that's kind of what your students would do as a class, is create their own carbon cycle using those pictures. And those little hexagonal pictures are included in the lesson for you guys to print out and use with your students. But you would pass out a picture or one of those captions to your students, and then have them come up to the board and create their own carbon cycle based off of what they know or what they've been taught. And then they can also add labels and captions and writing with markers. But again, it's just kind of hitting home with the carbon cycle, so they have a good basic foundation of carbon and how it's cycled through the atmosphere before they focus in on livestock emissions and how cattle kind of play a role in that. And so if you scroll down to the next activity, this is kind of where we talk about the carbon hoofprint of cows or beef, and explains how all ruminant animals, cows, bison, elk, sheep, goats, they all produce methane. And so ruminant animals have 4 compartments to their stomach, and that allows them to digest and eat lots of forages and roughages and fibrous feeds like grass and hay. And when they digest that hay and they feed on forages, it goes to a compartment in their stomach called the rumen, and that's where it ferments, and that's where your methane is produced as a byproduct in that stomach. And so there is a video clip included with the lesson that you can show your students, and it'll just kind of go through that digestive system of a cow and explain those 4 compartments. And if you scroll down, those 4 compartments are listed there. And then there is an activity if you use interactive science notebooks. This is a perfect insert for notebooks where they discuss those 4 compartments and really kind of understand how that fermentation creates methane as a byproduct that cows then exhale or burp. And then the final activity for this lesson is using the claim, evidence, and reasoning model. And there are handouts included in this lesson that kind of walk students through this CER model, where they, if you can see right there in step number 3, they cite the claim, or they state a direct response to the question. They find reliable information that supports the claim. And then reasoning, they link that claim to evidence by explaining how it supports the claim. And so this is just a good activity for students to kind of filter through articles or reports or research about cattle and livestock and climate change, and kind of determining what's reliable information, what's true, and what's based off of scientific research and facts. And so it'll kind of walk you through that CER model with your students. And again, you can see right there in 6, we pull in a specific article, and that's another article from Frank Mittlener at UC Davis. He's kind of known as, his nickname is actually the greenhouse gas guru. And so you'll see his name a lot when it comes to climate change and cows and livestock. But then just below that, if you scroll down a little bit more, you can see right there, it gives examples. And then at the bottom, we have the elaboration and evaluation. And those are the key concepts that students should have a good understanding of after this lesson. Carbon's an element in the atmosphere. And then it talks about changes in global or regional climate patterns is known as climate change. And then talks about how cows, their contribution to climate change and their methane emissions. And then again, like I said, you're gonna see Frank Mittlener's name a lot. It's down there in the enriching activities. There are lots of different videos and articles and podcasts that you can listen to with your students or have your students listen to or read. And you can also see it's linking you over to some of Andrea's lessons, her climate change phenomena lesson, and as well as that e-magazine that we were talking about earlier is down there at the bottom. And so again, a good high school lesson, there's a lot of science included in this lesson, but it's a great way to introduce the carbon cycle if you haven't talked about that with your students yet, and then kind of dive into some real world issues of climate change and agriculture and cows and how they affect the environment.
Okay, awesome. I'm gonna head back here. So that's that lesson. The next one is called Climate Change Phenomena, Bananas in Our Breadbasket. And as I introduced this lesson to you, this one's specifically for middle school. It can be adapted to high school easily if you like this approach, but we're teaching the same concepts of the carbon cycle and climate change, but we're using a little bit different example that I think I've gotten some good feedback from teachers who have already piloted this lesson, and it's a really good draw. So what I'm gonna do is we're gonna do a little bit of a quiz. I'm gonna be showing you some pictures of some maps of where food comes from. I want you to use the chat box and type in what food you think this map represents based only on the location that it is grown. Okay, so use the chat box. Okay, look at the blue dots here. What crop are we talking about? We're talking about plants specifically. All right, I've already got some winners. This is apples. Okay. All right, let's go to the next one. Again, look at the blue dots. Based on this map, what is grown here? Good. I'm not tricking very many of you that picked here. Okay, how about this one? There's a lot less dots on this one. Okay, this one's a little harder, but several of you, lots of you have got it. This is rice. Okay, how about this one? This one's a little trickier because this portion of the United States produces more than just this one crop here. This is specifically soybeans. Okay, next one, 3 states.
Well, they got it.
Yep, we got it. Oranges. Good. Okay, how about this one? Yep, you guys are good. This is wheat. Okay, so a little fact in here that goes with the title of this lesson is that this region of our country is known as the breadbasket because it has rich soil and is an ideal climate for the production of grain. So again, we are connecting science to food and agriculture. And for students to really think about climate change, I think it's a topic that a lot of people can kind of just shut off. There are some political ties to it, which sometimes turn some people off, but if we really stick straight to the science and really connect it to food and agriculture, this is such a slam dunk for student engagement. Okay, so now at this point, you should be thinking a lot about climate and where our food is grown. So why is rice only grown in those few places? Why are apples grown a lot in Washington? Okay, why, all of those questions we can ask, why are these grown? And again, and in addition to that, are all crops grown in all 50 states? Can you find those in every state? Okay, could you go to the grocery store and buy homegrown produce in each of your hometowns? Okay, you couldn't, and why? It's because of climate. Climate is so important to our food supply. Okay, so I have one more for you. I want to know where bananas are grown. Okay, here's a map. The darker blue is where it shows the most banana production. Bananas is one food crop that is all imported. You will find a few bananas grown in Hawaii and Florida, but not commercially. So anything we find in the grocery store is going to be grown outside of our country. Again, why? Because of climate. Okay, so present to your students these maps, and this is all connected in the lesson, But present to your students these maps and get them connecting their food supply to climate and location and weather and what is required to grow all these foods, and then ask them this question: could bananas ever be grown in our breadbasket? Is there any chance that we would be one day be growing bananas in the 48 states? Okay, just get that. And this is part of phenomena-based learning that we find in science. Okay, I just saw a comment, I hope not. And I'm probably there along with you, but it's such a good tie. It's such a good hook for students to be thinking, okay, bananas are grown outside of the United States for a reason, but is our temperature going to continue to rise? If it does, what is that going to impact? And if we can grow bananas here, what can't we grow down the road? Like, just really get their minds thinking about all of the implications that climate change and climate in general has to our food supply. Okay, so that's kind of the tie that we have in this lesson. I'm going to take you quickly to it. And now that you've seen a lesson on the matrix, and hopefully you've been there before, but I'm not going to spend quite as much time going through every step of it. But again, this is a middle school, it's aligned to middle school standards, but you can adapt it if you need to, if you like this type of hook that it's got in it. Okay, so we've got our materials, the purpose. So students will explore the carbon cycle and evaluate associated phenomena of climate as they discover the impact climate change could have on the farms that produce our food. Okay, so this isn't just something in the news. This isn't just a political, something tied to politics, but this is some science and this is our food. So why is it important? So again, all of your files are here in the essential files. Coming down, you've got a lot of background. We call this the Teach the Teacher section. I was a teacher long enough to know that sometimes you feel like you're fooling yourself and somebody else because you're still learning too, but we're all in the same boat. So this is for you to be able to learn some background information that'll give you what you need to be successful. I'm going to point out this map right here. This is a map that the FAO put out that says changes in agricultural production by the year 2050 based on climate change predictions. So red is the parts of the world that we will be most impacted by climate change if it continues as it's projected. So you can look and see that a lot of parts of Africa and warm parts of the parts that are warm or hot in the world now, if they get hotter, are obviously going to be impacted severely. You could also use this as a little bit of a critical thinking point to say, okay, well, if this gets warmer here and we can't grow things at the equator like we used to, could we then grow them somewhere else? The problem is that while it might move, where are the cooler crops going to be grown? Okay, so just a little map that can bring some engagement to your students. So again, what we just did together at looking those maps is the interest approach, or the hook to get your students interested in this. This uses the Climate Change Phenomena e-magazine that I've already shown you. So there's one more way that you can access it. Then you're going to teach the carbon cycle. And this is using some of the materials I used to teach you guys and to lay that foundation of the different spheres on the earth, different processes that move carbon from one sphere to the other. And I want to point out this red text right here. Whenever you see red text in the matrix and this little sign, this is something that is a really good point to use some critical thinking in your classroom. So one of the things that you'll find in these printouts is that the red colors are human-induced activities that are driving the carbon cycle, and the blue ones are natural things that happen. But point out digestion from cattle and other ruminants, and it's red here, but ask students to really think about, should it be red or should it be blue? Because even if we had no farms, there would still be ruminant animals that lived on the earth that released methane into the air due to their digestion system. Okay, so it's a really good way to get students to think about agriculture. And when we are teaching agricultural literacy, it's not to be saying that agriculture doesn't impact climate change, because that's false. It's putting it in the correct context and understanding how and why and in what proportion. Okay, because those are the things that get blown out of proportion without the science and with media. Okay, so take a look there and you can have your students understand that actually this card could be red and blue, because the animals would be here regardless of human activity, but because we farm them to get milk and meat, then we have more of them. So just to help them think about human activity is a really good critical thinking point. Okay, so there's the carbon cycle. They compare those two. And the next part dives in, and this overlaps a little bit into climate smart agriculture, which is the next lesson. Okay, so I'm going to go back to this next section. So this is a high school lesson that uses a lot of the same procedures and approaches as the phenomena lesson, but this one is talking a little bit more about climate smart agriculture. So when I say climate smart agriculture, you can relate it to things that we know in our own personal activities. Like we know that if we decrease our driving, the use of fossil fuels, you know, something we've seen probably, at least I've seen in the news with the shutdown from the coronavirus, that with less travel that our world is healthier because there's less fossil fuels being put into the air. Okay, so climate smart agriculture has the same practices. So what can we do in agriculture to improve the health of our climate is what this lesson is approaching. Okay, so to do that, I want to show you this image that we've got in the lesson. There's 3 things that we focus on in this lesson that we can do to be climate smart. Okay, so the first one is increasing productivity. So producing food, fuel, and fiber for our world requires the use of natural resources. Okay, and natural resources come at a cost to our environment. We can't use water, we can't use fossil fuels, we can't, soil nutrients, fertile soil, all of those things are natural resources that have to be used. Okay, so and we can't do agriculture without them. So if we increase the productivity and efficiency of our farming practices, we can produce more fuel while having more food. We produce more food while using less inputs from our environment. So increasing productivity. And I'm going to touch back as an example on something that Bekka has already introduced with the carbon hoofprints lesson, and that's just the efficiency of beef production and how it's different in some countries versus others. Okay, so if we have this statement that US beef has a lower carbon hoofprint in the United States than it does, say, these purple countries in Africa and India especially, what does that mean? So I want you to think of cattle. We produce beef from cattle and we also produce milk from cattle. One cow is going to produce about the same amount of methane into the environment as the next cow. But if for example, a dairy cow that produces 6 gallons of milk a day versus another cow that produces 8 gallons of milk, being more efficient, having animals that are selectively bred to produce more milk and all of those kind of things, this makes it that we're more efficient. So yes, we're still putting methane into the air, but we're producing more food in the process. Hopefully that makes sense. The same with beef production. The amount of beef that comes off of the cattle that are produced in the United States is more than what's produced in other parts of the world, which has a lot to do with genetics. It has a lot to do with science, feed available. There's a lot that goes into it. Even culture goes into it, because one of those countries is India, and part of their culture is that cows are sacred and that they don't typically slaughter them and use them for meat. So their efficiency is obviously going to be lower in what they're able to produce. They do produce milk, but so that's just kind of some things to think about. And across the board, these have been cattle examples I've given you, but across the board in thinking about growing any crop, the more we can use science and technology to be more efficient and more productive in agriculture, the more climate smart that we are being. Okay. The next one is enhancing resilience. So one of the things to understand in climate change is that even if all of our practices change today and turned on a dime, which they can't, but even if they could, the impacts of climate change are years and years ahead already. So it's not just something that can just stop on a dime and turn and stop the impacts of climate change. So one thing we have to understand is that regardless of the changes that we're making now, we also have to adapt to a warmer climate and adapt to a changing climate. And so we need to enhance our resilience and our ability to grow food and produce it in a climate that's changing. So that's what enhanced resilience means. So one example that we can talk about is, can plant breeding practices improve our drought resistance in crops, as one example? So if we're gonna have less and less water and higher temperatures, for example, can we use genetics through genetic modification, selective breeding, and other plant breeding methods? Can we use those to improve, to be more climate smart? Okay, so that's enhancing resilience. The next example is to reduce emissions. So this is actually the greenhouse gases that are being put into the atmosphere. How can we reduce emissions? There's a lot of different ways to do this, but one example that I'm going to give you is, if you were to imagine a field, any given field across the nation is going to be perhaps plowed, fertilized, maybe the weeds are going to be sprayed, it's going to be harvested. There's several times that a farmer is going to have to drive a tractor back and forth across the field to perform a specific task. If we can decrease the amount of times a farmer has to drive a tractor across a field, that's going to decrease the carbon emissions that come from the tractor and the burning of fossil fuels. Okay, if we can keep food closer to home and transport it less, that's going to reduce emissions. And there's a long list of things that we could talk about with reducing emissions. But as a summary, these are the three things that this lesson outlines for students to investigate different ways that we can be climate smart in agriculture. So how can we increase productivity? How do we enhance our resilience? And how do we reduce our emissions? Okay. So now that I have brought that up, I do want to show you this. It's just a minute. This is an example of, in Costa Rica, of ways that they've changed their agriculture to be more climate smart. So we're just going to watch the first minute of this video. If you want to show the rest of it, it's in the lesson plan.
40 years ago, hungry cattle deforested an entire region of Costa Rica. Now, these same hills are covered with trees and healthy pastures, a testament to Costa Rica's decades-long commitment to agriculture that protects the environment and reduces global warming. Jose Leon Vargas runs his cattle ranch with this commitment in mind. Fences are made from living teak trees. Forest ecosystems absorb carbon dioxide and protect native wildlife. Water comes from naturally maintained springs. Nutrient-rich grass protects against soil erosion and feeds his livestock. For Leon Vargas and other farmers and ranchers in Costa Rica, climate-smart practices are not just good for the planet, they make economic sense.
Sí se ven beneficios económicos, sino que también hay una satisfacción personal que es la relación que tiene uno con el medio ambiente.
These workers are busy growing saplings from seeds donated by farmers. When they're a little larger, they'll be sold back to farms at a minimal cost. Trees are a vital part of Costa Rica's climate-smart agricultural movement. So-called living fences stretch across the lush landscape. Growing trees are planted in rows and strung with...
Okay, I'm going to stop it right there, but this goes on with numerous examples. Like I said, it's embedded into the lesson, so you can see it there. But just another example of ways that we're using science, using technology, and making better choices for our future in agriculture. So, all right, so these are the three lessons that we have covered in this workshop. All of them you can access on the National Agricultural Literacy Curriculum Matrix. We encourage you to use them. We encourage you to give us feedback. All of our lessons have a little yellow symbol in them that you can hook to a survey. That comes right to me. And I love to see that feedback because it really helps us to make better and more resources for you in the future.
Okay, so we've had a few people ask on the chat if these are all in the matrix, and all 3 of these lessons are on the National Agricultural Literacy Matrix. And so it's agclassroom.org. So if you click on that link, it'll take you to the homepage. And I'm just gonna briefly show you guys how to search for a lesson using the matrix. So you can see the homepage there. And then just there below the banner, you have the curriculum matrix section. There you can do a keyword search. So today we've been doing climate change. So let's search climate change as the keyword. And it will pull in all of the lessons linked or tied to climate change. And so you can see there are a few lesson plans there. And it also pulls in companion resources, which may be different forms of multimedia, books, infographics, podcasts, anything like that, other websites. Brings up a list of resources in addition to the lesson plans. And if you scroll back up to the top, depending on the topic that you search, sometimes there'll be a lot more lessons. And so you can actually drill down and really specify what grade level you want to search for. So if you want specific middle school climate change lessons, you can select just the middle school option and search those, and it'll filter in your specific middle school climate change lesson plans. And then if you want to branch out and start looking at other content subjects, you can select science, different social studies, things like that. Just do a general science search to pull in all of the high school science lessons if that's what you're looking for. And it'll, like I said, pull in exactly what you want to look for and what you want to search, depending on the grade level that you teach and the content that you're looking for.
It's being a little slow because there's so many science lessons.
And I was going to say, somebody just mentioned, Melanie from Iowa mentioned, don't forget the blind binder option as well.
Oh, yes. Yep, there's also the binder lesson or feature as well. And you can actually start adding the lessons that you take and you use. And if it's something you really like, you can add it to your own binder and keep all of your lessons together in one location. So you don't have to go and re-find them every time you want to use them. And if we ever make changes or updates to these lessons, it'll automatically update in your binder as well. So they're always up to date and like I said, updated. And is there anything else you wanted to go over with that, Andrea?
I think that's all.
Yeah, I think let's open it up for some questions. We do have a few in the Q&A box. So somebody was asking, just a second. YUMPU, have you liked using, is it Yumpa? Is that how you say it? Yumpu to create digital magazines? Is it fairly easy to use?
We have a few resources in the matrix that uses I don't know if it's Yumpu, YUMPUU, but it's been a good one for us as far as an ability to put something digital and to have it out for people. So there's lots of different services, but that's one that we've used.
It said, another person asked, can you please show the remote resources? I'm not sure what they're referring to.
Remote?
Yes. I don't know. And somebody said, put the web address down again. It was too fast for me. And I asked which one, so.
We can, there's the 3 different lesson plans and the e-magazine we can put in there again.
Okay.
One thing else I'd like to point out is just to encourage you guys to connect with us. If you haven't already, we'd love all of you to be following National Agriculture in the Classroom, either on Facebook, Instagram, or Twitter. As we post new lessons, this is where we announce them. We feature lessons regularly. So that's a place we'd like you to follow. But another place we'd like you to follow is to follow your own state's agriculture in the classroom. And one way you can get to that is by visiting the Ag in the Classroom website, where you will see, and I'm going to share this link, but if you come here to this state and territory program website that I'm going to put in the chat right now, you can find your state's website as well as your state's Facebook page if they have it. So we really encourage you to follow both of them, because your local state Ag in the Classroom organization is going to give you a lot of local information, local resources. Some have a lot of free resources that are available only to you in your specific state, but also to follow National Ag in the Classroom to receive that information as well. So that's a really good way to stay connected.
Are there any other questions for Andrea or Bekka? Denise had, does carbon footprint of beef include production only or the entire farm to table commodity chain? And Bekka answered that, production only. Frank Mittler goes into more detail in this in his YouTube playlist on the entire farm to table chain.
Yeah, so that lesson will mostly discuss the production of beef cattle. But like I said, that YouTube playlist, Frank Mittler discusses all aspects of cattle production and then compares it to other food production chains as well. But he has about 6 or 7 different videos in that playlist, and he discusses different topics on each video on YouTube.
Yeah, and just to reiterate what I had said earlier, we will make their presentation available and a video recording of this presentation to all the registrants, so you guys will have access to these lessons. They showed you where they are on the matrix as well, but you'll have access to their presentation too for some of the slides that they used, but I'm sure a lot of that's in those lessons as well. So yeah, let me check, see if there's any more questions, but great presentation and just a lot of information, good food for thought. Really appreciate y'all putting this together and presenting today. Thank you so much.
Thank you everybody for coming. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you for joining us, everybody. And the next session, which is the last one for the summit, is at 4:30 Eastern time in a half hour. I have a plan, developing project-based learning plans for agricultural literacy. You'll see Andrea again on that session, along with Deborah Spielmaker and Lynn Whalen. So we really appreciate Andrea and Bekka for the time and the great presentation today and the great resources you developed. We really, I think they'll be put to good use. So thank you, ladies.
Awesome.
And goodbye, everybody. See some of you in a half hour.